Hello, ladies and gentlemen. As you all know, I'm David, and today we're going to be talking about this book, which is Vaccination Against Smallpox by Edward Jenner. Um, it's not a long read, as you can see here. It's rather thin, uh, but that doesn't diminish in any way the importance of this book to history or to human life on this planet today. Um, Let me first say this before we go further. The smallpox virus is not the smallpox vaccine rather is not normally given anymore due to its eradication in approximately 1980 or so. I personally believe in vaccines, and also I want to point out that this book was written over 200 years ago. So this video is a summary of like some um, comments I'm going to make about what's in here, and is of course not medical advice. And of course, in general, I recommend that anyone make the decision about whether or not to get a vaccine based on their discussion with their doctor, who can best make a decision or make a right advice based on their medical situation. Now, what is smallpox? So smallpox is a viral disease that has been the scourge of humanity from thousands of years. They have found Egyptian mummies that had evidence of the pustules that are characteristic of smallpox. And so it's been with us for thousands of years, before written history for sure. And let me also say this. It was fatal in approximately 30% of cases, so it was a terrible scourge. By the way, on a separate note, this particular image we see here is an electron micrograph of the smallpox virus itself, something that humans were only able to witness after the 1930s when the electron microscope was invented. Now, prior attempts of prevention, because smallpox has been such a scourge on humanity, there was a desire to prevent it because there was no treatment that was known for it. One technique that was originally developed at a time lost to history, China, and then in China and India, and of course later in Africa and other places, finally in Europe, was known as variolation. The idea here, or the technique that was done, was that they would take, one technique was they would take a scab from a patient who had had the smallpox. They would grind it, and then they would blow this into someone's nose, someone who had not been exposed to smallpox. The idea being that they would get exposed to it and in a novel way, and usually patients who got variolated, they did get the smallpox, but it usually, for whatever reason, did not present itself at full strength, and then they would be immune for life. Another way that they would variolate people was that they would take the fluids, let's say, from the pustule, and they would rub it into a scratch that was made on the skin somewhere, the scratch being about, let's say, half an inch or so. They would rub the material there. The person would get sick, but again, because of the small amount of material and because of the way that they did it in a very superficial way, it's not a slice into the skin. I don't want you to get the wrong impression. This is just a scratch, quote unquote, a scratch, and it would cause the people to get smallpox, but the fatality rates associated with the variolation was about 1 to 2%, much lower, dramatically lower than the 30% of the people who would get the smallpox naturally. So Edward Jenner occurred about 1700s. His researchers that are written about in this book came out in about 1790s or so, 1796, 1797, and so on. But anyway, he was aware of the fact that there was a common belief held that milkmaids might have, that milkmaids didn't seem to get smallpox. It was very rare for a milkmaid to have pockmarked skin, to have suffered the smallpox. And there was a belief in the town where he lived, in the region where he lived, that this might be because of the fact that they were exposed to the cowpox. But what he notes is that no one else had done any research on this. He notes that it's very interesting that this has not occurred. So, for example, let me just read what he says here. In the present age of scientific investigation, it is remarkable that a disease of so peculiar a nature as the cowpox, which has appeared in this and some of the neighboring counties for such a series of years, should so long have escaped particular attention. Finding the prevailing notions on the subject both among men of our profession and others extremely vague and indeterminate, and conceiving that facts might appear at once both curious and useful, I have instituted as strict an inquiry into the causes and effects of this singular malady as local circumstances would admit. And so basically he's saying here that he finds it shocking that such an anomaly, that these milkmaids being essentially seemingly free of smallpox, and that it's potentially due to cowpox. He's shocked that no other scientists have pursued such a line of inquiry. So he decided to do so in the pages of this book. So this is the book, Vaccination Against Smallpox. And if you want, you can buy it at my link. So now, what drew me to read Jenner's treatise? Number one, I was curious to read one of the pioneers of vaccination. This is definitely one of the great inventions of all history. Why is it a great invention? Because vaccination has saved innumerable lives. It's hard to gauge how many lives have been saved by vaccines, but a lot of us, literally owe our existence to vaccines. There's really no other way to say it. I wanted to also see how this Jenner performed his experiments and what experiments he performed to derive the conclusions that he reached, and to see how he explained his conclusions. It's one thing to know that Edward Jenner was involved with vaccines and to read a small snippet about, let's say in an encyclopedia, that he performed these experiments and that he's credited with finally, giving more of a solid foundation to believe in vaccination and why one would want to vaccinate and all these things. But it's another thing to read his own words, in this case his own words, to see what he thought about it. And I wanted to see how he communicated his research, because different people say things in different ways, and it's always interesting to see how someone says the things that they want to say. It's like a fingerprint, of who they are. Let me also make a little detour here. I want to state something that happened a lot later, and that is the Koch's postulates. In about 1884 or so, some sources will say, Robert Koch developed these 4 postulates for determining conclusively whether a particular bacterial agent was responsible for a disease. So he said that a specific microorganism is always associated with a given disease. Number 2, that you can isolate this microorganism in the laboratory and you can grow it by itself. That 3, the cultured microbe will cause the disease when you reintroduce it into a healthy animal. And 4, that same microorganism will be found in the diseased animal. Now, of course, I'm quoting this because some of the ideas that Jenner was applying in his book, about 80 years before before these postulates were stated, you can already see hints as to the kind of thinking that inspired Koch along these lines. And I want to make a brief distinction. Obviously, Koch was talking about microorganisms like bacteria, and Jenner was talking about a virus. So they're not exactly identical, but you can already see in Jenner, and obviously this was accepted medical thought at the time, that some of these ideas were already beginning to present themselves. The idea that a microorganism was associated with the disease. The idea that you could take the disease from one person, let's say in this case we're talking about a human disease, right? From one person to another, and that this other person would also have that microorganism available to infect someone else. So I saw some of these ideas in when I was reading Jenner's book, and I wanted to bring these into the discussion just so that we could have this as a, the advantage of reading historical work, but with some modern, basically the fruits of like other researchers down the line that we can appreciate better what happened before. So for example, there's this one observation. Let me read this. Other practitioners who visited the patient at my request agreed with me in this point, that there was no room left for suspicion as to the reality of the disease, as I inoculated some of his family from the pustules who had the smallpox with its usual appearances in consequence. So what I want to point out here is Jenner is talking about a particular patient, and there was a question as to the nature of the disease that the patient had. So he took material from the patient, he inoculated someone else, and those people who he inoculated got the smallpox. He could identify it as the smallpox, and so he knew that this person from whom the material was taken had the smallpox. You can already see how that's similar to the idea that Koch is articulating much later. This is a great example also. Check this out. On page 29, Jenner describes how he tried to infect Pede and Barge. These are two of Jenner's patients, and of course, in this case, experimental subjects. He's trying to infect them with smallpox. Not because he wants to hurt them, obviously, but he's trying to infect them with smallpox after he had already given them the cowpox. He gave both of them the cowpox. And he notes that he was not successful in getting them to take the smallpox. But here's the key thing. To ensure that the material that he was using was smallpox, he applied some of this material to an individual who was known to never have gotten the smallpox, and that patient got the smallpox. So in other words, and here again, this goes to again to those same ideas. Edward Jenner had given Pede and Barge, and of course we're going to talk about them later because they come up. The manner in which they got inoculated comes up later, and it's important for other reasons. But here I want to point out, Jenner verifies that the material he's using to try to get Pede and Barge to get the smallpox, he verifies that it actually is the smallpox and is capable of causing the smallpox by applying it to someone who is not exposed to the cowpox or the smallpox. We can see here, by using that control, he's able to say, look, this other person who has not gotten the smallpox, who has not gotten the cowpox, got the smallpox from the material I put in him. Whereas these two children who I gave the cowpox to are not showing any signs of the smallpox. So something, and of course Jenner here is arguing that the cowpox is the reason, something is causing these two children, Pede and Barge, to be resistant to the cowpox, to the smallpox. A huge issue. Now, let me make a brief point here. What happened with Pede and Barge is that there was a farmhand who had the cowpox, and Jenner recounts how he took material from the farmhand and he used it to inoculate Pede. Then from Pede, Pede got the cowpox, and from the cowpox from Pede, he inoculated someone else. So they too could get the cowpox. And after a series of such sequential inoculations, he gets the barge. And he later relates how he's doing this as a way of determining whether the cowpox that someone would get after being inoculated through several people would still have the protection that the person who had cowpox from the original source had. And this is part of that experimentation. And he showed that, in fact, they do. So check this out. Here is the more explicit explanation of that. If you're reading the book, the one I have, on page 27 in the following two, he notes the sequence of cowpox inoculations he did from the William Summers, that's the farmhand, to William Pede, to Hannah Excel, and then to various others. And of course, after Hannah Excel, it was someone else, and after that person, it was Barge, meaning Barge was 5 times removed. And basically, he later verifies that my supposition here was correct, that he wanted to determine if the cowpox, if you inoculate a person, and from that person you inoculate another person, and then from that person you inoculate another person, and then from that person you inoculate another person, if that chain preserves the protective qualities of cowpox against smallpox in a patient, thereby inoculating. He showed that that is true. It's an incredible thing. Now, here's the key thing. Why do we care about what Jenner is saying? You know, now, obviously, to us, looking backwards at him through history, you know, smallpox was eradicated in 1980 largely through his, not through his efforts directly, but through the people who followed in his research, in his footsteps, and so on. But what he argues in this book is not only that vaccination, it's not just that he noticed that this cowpox lent a defense against smallpox. It was that he said that it was preferable to do the inoculation with the cowpox because he observed that cowpox is a much more mild disease. One of the people he writes letters to, and whose letter he receives in the mail, a fellow doctor, tells Jenner, you know, I even give it to my pregnant patients because it's a very safe thing, the cowpox, relative to other things. He talks about how, Jenner again, talks about how the cowpox itself is not transmissible from one person to another unless you explicitly do the inoculation, which of course is very useful if you know, whereas smallpox, one person gets it, they're all going to get it. You give someone cowpox, and that person is not going to transmit the cowpox to someone else. So it lets you target the treatment to the person who you want to give it to and feel secure in knowing that they're not going to give that to someone else. That, again, it's milder, has less negative consequences, and provides the protection against the real monster, in this case, smallpox. So in other words, I can give a patient a milder disease, knowing that it'll prevent them from the real harm of the more dangerous disease. This is the argument he's making, is that this is better than variolation, and of course better than anything else, like being without the vaccination. Now the next question is this: is the protection durable? Okay. And the two cases he starts out with are one of a man and one of a woman. The man had gotten the cowpox, I think it was 30 years beforehand, like about 3 decades, 36 years, I believe he said. And he says that he had the cowpox when he was young. And then Jenner talks about how he says, okay, I'm going to attempt to make you take on the smallpox. So he scratches him, he puts some smallpox material, and this man does not get the smallpox. So what Jenner argues is that this person who lived way out in the middle of nowhere, where it would have been well documented had there been a smallpox epidemic in the past, had not had the smallpox. And he did have the cowpox because he remembered that he had it as a child. And so Jenner says that if this was a city, there might have been a chance that there could have been some infection where he would have gotten the smallpox in the past. He would have gotten some disease in the past. And so the data would be more muddy. Harder to believe whether it is in fact the cowpox that he got and that was what provided protection, or whether he had been exposed to smallpox in the past and that was what provided him the protection. Since he said that this man lived in a region where there was basically very little such activity because it's right in the fields, in the ranchlands, but he did have the cowpox, and 36 years later he resisted the smallpox. He uses that as some evidence to show that the cowpox gives a long-term protection against smallpox. It's not that I'm going to give you this as a preventative, and like 5 years down the road you're going to need to get it again, which is of course not bad either. But what was remarkable to him is that it would give lifelong protection. Now, in the second case, there was a girl. Her name was Sarah Portlock, and he talks about how she had gotten the disease about 26 years ago, and that he was also unable to get her to get infected with smallpox, and it was known that she had gotten the cowpox. 27 years earlier. Now, here's the next question. Okay, sure. These two people, they got cowpox. They got cowpox forever ago, naturally. And they did not respond to Jenner's attempts to get them to get smallpox. Could it be something else? Could they be superhuman? Could they have a gene that, well, in our language, today knowing a lot more about the mechanisms of life, could they have a gene that prevented them from being susceptible to to smallpox, right? So, to this question, I'm going to take one example here. On page 24, in case 17, Jenner talks about how he takes cowpox material from a dairy maid to inoculate a child, okay? And he talks about how he, again, makes a small incision. Again, we're talking about a very small incision. And he places the material in the incision, and he causes the child to get that cowpox. He then, 2 months later, he attempts to get the child to take the smallpox, and the child does not develop the smallpox. Here, because this child is so young, he knows the child has not had cowpox before. He knows the child has not gotten smallpox before. He exposes the child to cowpox, and then 2 months later, after an exposure to smallpox, and the child not taking on the smallpox, he's showing that there's a very strong reason to think that it was that cowpox exposure that prevented that smallpox from taking hold in the body. In a case we just talked about earlier, in the case of Pete and Barge, the two children, he's also making this point. Because in Pete, he had inoculated him with the cowpox. And of course in Barge the same, he had inoculated him with the cowpox. They then are attempted to be inoculated with the smallpox, and they don't develop it. So he's showing that there's a link, right? Now the next question. Can the material to perform a vaccination be preserved? See, this is huge. Because obviously if you don't have someone around, let's imagine we're back in the 1790s when Jenner is running the show, or when Jenner is running his experiments, What if you don't have someone on hand who has the cowpox from whom to take a sample and inoculate someone new? How are you going to get the material, right? So let's think about the modern life. For most of us, if we've gotten a vaccine, we just literally can go to the pharmacist. Sometimes we need to go to a doctor, and they can take this little glass ampule, and they take this little itty bitty drop of fluid, and then either, depending on the kind of vaccine, they either inject us with the vaccine, or they give us a drop of it in our tongue, and then we're vaccinated. That's it, right? But this is the result of modern technology and a far more developed understanding of how the body works, of how disease works, what causes disease, the immune response, and stuff like that. Now, of course, there are still many open questions there, right, in the modern world, that our understanding relative to where he was is much further. And of course, so like we never take it, we take it for granted, right? So this actually becomes an important question to him, because he asks, you know, he knows that there's something there. He's already demonstrated through like 20 cases that he lists in his book. And in the back half of his book, he has letters from other practitioners, other doctors who he's written to, that have done the talks about Sarah Merlin, who he states had what is known as a case of spurious cowpox. Um, in the case of Sarah Merlin, on her hands and on the body of that cow that Sarah Merlin, who was a milkmaid, on the body of the cow that Sarah was milking, there were these lesions that were white in color. Whereas in the case of the true cowpox, they had a bluish hue. But in any case, she had white blisters, white lesions, and this particular disease, which was on her hand and on the cow and one of the cows, was not as contagious as the true cowpox. And he notes this because it was a common misidentification, and it showed to him that it needed that a careful identification program was going to be needed to prevent other practitioners from selecting material that would not be viable against smallpox, because it is not cowpox. The second thing is about the time of the harvesting of this material. One of the things that Jenner talks about in his book is he notices that the moment that the infection takes hold, there's this period where the pustule forms, where the material is infectious and where it can be used to inoculate patients, and where it will cause the disease to be formed in the patient that he's inoculating with the cowpox. But that there's a moment when it goes too far, the time goes too far, and the material is no longer infectious. Now, of course, in his treatment, he doesn't yet know about viruses. Well, he knows there is a virus. He uses the word virus. But he doesn't know like the nature of the virus, right? And of course, again, he would not have been able to see the virus himself. Magnification back then was limited to optical microscopes, and it was not until the advent of electron microscopes that us, humanity, were able to see the smallpox virus itself. The only way that you could see viruses, let's say in Jenner's time, I don't think they were imaging them so much in any case, but I guess conceivably you could have observed a sample of cells and you could see cells dying for some unknown reason. I know that much later on this was done prior to the invention of the electron microscope. You had some people researching in bacterial laboratories. They would see cells like basically popping on their petri dishes, and they didn't know what it was. Later, they were going to find out that it was viruses. Anyway, but so for him, he had no way of knowing what made that distinction, except for the fact that there was some quality in the material that changed, that made the material infectious at a certain time, no longer infectious after the fact. So it was important that the material for inoculation be harvested at the right time. The other thing was the storage of the material. So he talks about how you take the material at the prime moment and you smear it on a piece of glass or on a quill, which is the end of a feather, and you wait for it to dry all the way until it's bone dry, and then you put it in a glass vial to take with you on your inoculations for your patients. And he mentions in a footnote that using such a process, he himself was able to use material that he had gotten 3 months earlier with good effect. In other words, to cause a person to develop the cowpox disease. And just think about this. This is at a time before refrigeration. You know, the COVID vaccine that just came out recently, some of them had to be kept in very cold refrigerators. Otherwise, they would break down. That's not to say anything about them that is negative, but that's just to show that even way back then, when Jenner was around, he was already thinking about this. Because again, for Jenner, he wanted to make sure that he could produce a true case of cowpox to lead to that protection that he saw that it could confer. And on a separate note, on page 34, again regarding material storage, he talks about a medical practitioner of that time who he had seen with a cotton ball that had the material, that he had put it into the glass vial without letting it dry first. And so he talks about how when this material had been opened, it had a negative, it had the smell of putrefaction. And so Jenner talks about in his book about how that means that a person who was quote unquote inoculated with this material was actually not getting inoculated against smallpox. In fact, he talks about how he is unclear what is actually happening in that situation, but that he talks about how it renders the virus ineffective. So of course, again, it's not that he doesn't know, but of course, the exact nature of viruses and these kind of details were not known to him, but he knew that something was happening in the putrefaction process that prevented that putrefied material from causing the immune response that was desired. And so he says that this leads to two different terrible things. Number one, the person will falsely believe that they're secure from smallpox infection. And number two, it means that they will have gotten sick from the putrefied material. And of course, at a time before antibiotics, for some of these people, that might not have been a good thing. Now, here he gives a case where he had some material that he had stored properly, and he gave the cowpox to Susan Phipps from his stored sample, um, and then he was able to use the cowpox from Phipps to inoculate a girl named Mary Hearn. And so this was again another demonstration where, okay, I can save this material. And again, he was able to show that some samples lasted 3 months. And I can now give it to someone else 3 months later. And then from them developing the cowpox, I can now use that material to inoculate someone else. So in other words, although he doesn't describe it in this manner, if you wanted to generate more cowpox for more inoculations, for more storage, first you're going to need more of it. You could do it this way. You could, okay, I'm going to inoculate patient Y. They need to be inoculated. They're at my office. I'm going to tell them, look, I'm going to inoculate you. You're going to get the pustules in 3 days. I'm going to come by, and I'm going to secure some of the material so that I can inoculate further patients. Obviously, he doesn't describe this in the book, but I'm just speculating here as to this was another thought that he might have had. Again, I'm speculating, but this is what this tells me. And of course, he would then, of course, have prepared this again for him to store for later use so that he could inoculate more patients. Now, very early on in the treatment, on page 17, he talks about the case of Sarah Portlock. This is a girl who had had the cowpox 2.5 decades earlier, 27 years earlier, in fact. And not only does she resist getting smallpox when he tries to inoculate her, he notes that she was nursing her child at the time, that the child got the smallpox, but that the child had gotten a very mild form of the smallpox. And he doesn't mention this at all in the work. But I cannot help, as I was reading that portion, that he might have written it with the thought that maybe she, having had the cowpox and nursing her child, might somehow be transmitting the protection. Now again, Jenner doesn't say that, but I couldn't help but reading that when he read this, when he was writing this, that it's something to think about. And of course, I did not read about whether or not this is the case or not, but I can imagine that might have been one of the things that he was thinking of. Could it be that the milk was providing some protection to the child? It's an incredible, observation that was being made there. Now, here, there is a quote in this book that caught my eye. Quote, I have the pleasure, too, of seeing that the feeble efforts of a few individuals to depreciate this new practice are sinking fast into contempt beneath the immense mass of evidence which has risen up in support of it. Here he's describing what we would now consider anti-vaxxers. Now, of course, I am not an anti-vaxxer. I think vaccines are incredibly important, and I think, for the vast majority of us, vaccines are definitely the way to go. So many scourges of history, we don't even remember them anymore because we don't see them. We don't see them anymore, thankfully. And unfortunately, right now, there are some people who are anti-vaxxers, and I think that they're causing tremendous harm, regrettably so. And I think that, I think that it's, but anyway, I found it interesting that even then there were anti-vaxxers. I do have to say, though, that at that time, obviously, the knowledge of biology, the knowledge of disease, how disease was spread, why diseases, what made different diseases operate. These things were not known then that well. Some of the people who were anti-vax were probably well-meaning at the beginning. But I think, after you look at enough cases such as those outlined by Jenner and fellow doctors, it was very clear why Germany immediately, well, not immediately, but why Germany and England and various other countries began vaccinating aggressively, because they could see that the data was so massive on the side of the vaccinations um, that there was no reason to, there was no legitimate, there was no credible belief that it was something else, like magic, that was causing its protection. It was obviously the cowpox. Obviously, and of course now we know for sure 100%, us many years later. But even by the end of reading this book, and he writes about his own experiences, and he also includes the letters from fellow doctors who he has sent material to, and they do the vaccinations too, and they talk about how, I vaccinated all these people. In case one of the doctors writes to him, I vaccinated 400 people. He says, I've been retired, but the people, they just come now, they know I'm doing this vaccination thing, and they don't want to get smallpox, so they just come and I inoculate them, and I'm starting to see that I'm not getting as many smallpox cases anymore. And so eventually, but anyway, so this is, this was, so the fact that he noted this, caught my attention. And I want to also point out something else he talks about in his book, going back to the issue of the person with the cotton ball, the improperly stored material. Jenner saw that the spurious cowpox that did not lead to the preventative effect, and the improperly stored material, which also did not lead to the preventative effect of causing a successful cowpox infection, right? Because the cowpox infection was the one that protected against the smallpox. He noticed, and he talks about in his book, how these two characteristics served as evidence against vaccination. Because if a person got the inoculation, but it was a spurious cowpox or it was bad material, and then they get the smallpox, it causes people to lose faith. And he talks about how it's essential to know that it's cowpox for real, that you get the material at the right time, and that you store it properly. Because the more you can do it properly, you get the real effect, and the evidence becomes undeniable. Because you get the real protection that you can just see, and smallpox not running over your society anymore, or not ravaging a whole population. And of course, very early on in the vaccines in the 20th century, there was an unfortunate batch of polio vaccine that was made incorrectly in I forget if it was the 50s or something like that, and it caused a panic. And of course, after that, regulations were put in place to ensure that if you were a company and you were going to make a vaccine that was going to be given to humans or any animal, that you had to have the expertise in being able to manufacture a vaccine, that you had to have the facilities that were adequate to the production of such a pharmaceutical, that you had the money to be able to buy everything that was necessary to do it, and so on and so forth, so that you could count on getting a vaccine that works. In other words, like, that would be the modern version of what Jenner was talking about back there, about getting the right material, storing it properly, and knowing that it was the right stuff. Now, of course, when you read a book, obviously sometimes you're reading because you want to be entertained, like a story, or you want to escape into another world, like, for example, if you ever read Typee by Melville, it takes you into a different world. If you want to read, if you want to read, you sometimes go into another world. Sometimes you want to read nonfiction. In this case, the book I'm reading is nonfiction. But while I was reading the footnotes, well, first of all, let me say this. If you read this book, you're going to see that, the way he thinks about it is very interesting. The way he makes his case is very interesting. The way he describes all these phenomena is very interesting. But there are also some gems that are in the footnotes and also in the text itself. Like, for example, this gem here. This is a footnote. Mr. Holm, in his excellent dissertation on pus and mucus, justifies this assertion. Which, to my mind, is like incredible, because here Jenner is talking about an excellent dissertation on pus and mucus. It's a fascinating thing. No, but of course, the reality is, it probably is excellent, and I don't know if I'm going to read it, but I would be definitely curious to look at it to see what was so excellent about it, what he was talking about, and the different things. And this is where I got the photo of the smallpox virus that we saw earlier. And I hope you've liked this discussion. And if you are interested, I do recommend that you read this work. I think one of the things that he does in this book also that I haven't mentioned is that he describes a lot of questions that one realizes he won't have time to research. Not that he's saying, I won't be able to get to this, but that as you read it, that he's either not going to do it, not for laziness, but that he's not going to do it or he's not going to have time to do it. Us reading it, realizing that, you only have so much time. So, for example, some things he talks about the grease. The grease is a kind of disease that horses get. It's now called pastern dermatitis. And that's the actual technical name of it. And pastern dermatitis is what he calls the grease, and he thought that the cowpox was caused by the grease in horses, the quote-unquote the grease, the pastern dermatitis, that the horse farriers, the people who would be handling the horses would then touch the cows because they would milk the cows or something. The cows would then, that material would then cause the cow to get cowpox, and then the cowpox would then be able to be passed to a person who could then get the cowpox, and who could then, of course, be used to get the material for inoculation and so forth. That was later disproven, but he talks about how, to his mind, it was pretty assured that that was the source of the cowpox. And again, it shows that even great scientists can be wrong sometimes. It was later determined by someone else that it was not the grease that caused the cowpox, that was a different disease. He also talks about different kind of variations that he thought of doing with respect to the vaccination, but he mentions them kind of in passing, which to me suggests that these are nice ideas, but you can tell that they're not central to his research. So, he's probably not going to pursue them. But since they're here, they're open for others to pursue, of course. And of course, it's always like that, and I can tell you that reading a book like this takes you into another world. Like, for example, the way he did the experiments back then would never be allowed today. And I don't think anyone would ever think of doing them this way. For one thing, so many diseases are blood-borne that like, you wonder, like, how many diseases could be spread by doing it this way. But of course, that's the beautiful thing about having modern techniques, modern understanding, and the ability to isolate viruses, like using test cultures and stuff like that. But anyway, If you'd like to hear more about what I'm reading for whatever reason, or if you like my discussions, don't hesitate to subscribe. And until next time, be well.